This video is brought to you by my upcoming book, 101 Board Games to Try Before You Die. Pre-order it from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. The links are in the video description. Kia ora koutou, and welcome to this very special video about Board Game Hall of Fames. Specifically, we're talking about the Dice Tower and Board Game Geek Hall of Fames, and my issues with how they've been done. Now, while this might sound like it's an attack video, it really isn't. This isn't intended as a personal attack against anyone involved in the Hall of Fame process, nor am I saying that their Hall of Fames are without merit. There's just something in them fundamentally lacking from my point of view, and I felt compelled to make this video to discuss that point. And I'll just work you through that process a little bit. So initially I saw the list of games in both Hall of Fames and I looked through them and I was like, oh yeah, lots of these games make sense, or I might have put this one in here instead of that one. There are a couple of things I thought were obvious omissions that probably should have been in there. And I thought there was a little bit, like in the Board Game Geek one, a little bit of bias towards Euro games and not a lot of what I would call sort of mass market successful games like Hero Quest or Axis and Allies. I thought they'd gone for a lot of things like Power Grid and Concordia over those sort of games. And that sort of niggled me a little. So I thought about it a little bit and wondered why this was niggling me so much. You know, why were the particular games in this list bugging me? And then I had a bit of a revelation, a bit of a breakthrough. And it wasn't the list of games at all. It wasn't any of the games on the list that was bugging me. In fact, I don't think any of the games in the Board Game Geek Hall of Fame should be in the Hall of Fame. Nor do I think any of the games in the Dice Tower Hall of Fame should be in the Hall of Fame. Not one game. Because Hall of Fames should be for people. And that was what was bugging me. We have commodified board gaming to be the product. We've put the product in the Hall of Fame and not the people responsible for it. People go in Halls of Fame. You look at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You look at Sports Hall of Fames. I even look at the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame. It's about people. It's not about matches or events or individual songs or individual albums. It's about the people who were responsible for them. And I think fundamentally putting Board Game Geek Hall of Fames down as the products and not the people sends not a great message about our industry and how we think about people. I would rather like to see a Board Game Hall of Fame that is full of people rather than products. And today I'm going to take a wild stab at doing an initial 25 list, because Board Game Geek's initial list was 25 board games in their Hall of Fame. I want to put 25 people in a Board Game Hall of Fame and have a look at what that looks like, how different that feels as a Hall of Fame for the industry. I had a discussion with some of the folks on my Discord, and this was an initial 25 list we came up with. Now, bear in mind, this isn't a full committee. I have a very skewed and isolated view on the board game industry. I am literally a content creator living in the South Pacific. I'm not an industry insider, so I'm kind of going off a bunch of reckons, a bunch of things I've picked up over time, and, you know, some gut feel, and you know, it is very much a personal Hall of Fame with a little bit of input from some of my patrons. And if a Hall of Fame was ever to be done this way properly, I would absolutely expect a proper committee to go through and create a real list so people don't fall through the cracks. Because I absolutely guarantee I'm going to omit really big, important names that absolutely 100% should be in any kind of Hall of Fame. But I'm going to give it a stab anyway. Now, without too much more delay, let's get on to the list. And I'm going to run through these names pretty damn quickly. I don't want to keep you here for an hour. I'm going to spend maybe 15, 20 seconds on every single person in this list. After all, the main point is just to tease what a Hall of Fame with people in it would look like, not be the definitive Hall of Fame. So let's start it off now with number 1, Lizzie Magie. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Lizzie's story, she created a game called The Landlord's Game. The Landlord's Game was a critique of capitalism, and it showed how property owners can be exploitative. A version of this game was later released and called Monopoly, and Lizzie was not given credit for it. But Monopoly has absolutely been the most important board game of the modern era. Having a board game Hall of Fame that doesn't have Monopoly included in some way seems a bit silly to me. Yeah, we might not like the game as board game elitists, but there's no denying its impact and importance in the hobby. Lizzie was not officially recognised as the creator of Monopoly for a very, very long time. And I think an authentic Board Game Hall of Fame owes her and really should put her in for that. Lizzie Maggie is absolutely the first ballot Hall of Famer going in. Now from here on in, the list is predominantly white men from Europe and the United States. I suppose the awkward thing about doing a personal Hall of Fame like this is the industry has been absolutely dominated by white men from Europe and America. And if you do an individual list like this, it's almost entirely going to be white men from Europe and North America. I don't think we should run from that. I think that's something that we kind of have to acknowledge as an industry is the reality of the situation. Because if you don't acknowledge the reality of our past, we can't move towards a better and more diverse future. So I'm going to stick to my guns here and have predominantly white men from North America and Europe in this list. I think that's a fair representation of a Board Game Hall of Fame. I think the future should be different to this, and that's a future I want to work towards. But I'm not going to pretend the past wasn't the past when making this list. Anyway, this kind of stuff is why you have a committee, why you have a whole bunch of people making these calls and making these decisions, and why an individual list like this is ultimately quite flawed, because this is a hell of a lot of responsibility for me to take on my shoulders. I'm not going to solve the problem of diversity board gaming in this list, but I also don't want the debate to be focused on that. I'm just acknowledging it because someone will bring it up otherwise, and it's fair to bring it up. Next, I want to cover off some important designers from the 60s and the 70s, and we're going to start with Sid Sackson. Now, his cornerstone game is Acquire, but if you know much about Sid, he designed a bucket load of games. Very important and influential designer. Acquire might be the first modern board game, and if I recall correctly, it appears in both the Dice Tower and the Board Game Geek Hall of Fame on its own merit. Sid himself deserves to go in for not just Acquire, but a whole bunch of other games he designed over many, many, many years. Incredibly prolific designer. Next up is the design team of Bill Eberl, Jack Ketteridge, and Peter Olotka. This group designed two incredibly important games back in the 70s, and those games are Cosmic Encounter and Dune. Cosmic Encounter and Dune are incredibly influential in the thematic board game space. And I love that both these games were designed by essentially the same groups of people. One of the amazing things about these games is both Dune and Cosmic Encounter still hold up to this day, and you can see their fingerprints and their influence across so many other games in the board gaming hobby. Cosmic Encounter, with adding in variable player powers, really substantially changed the game. And Dune for being an area control sort of strategy game where each of the factions felt unique and different. There are so many successes to both these games, and it's amazing that they came from the same crew. Next up is Francis Tresham, who designed Civilization and 1830. Again, I believe both these games are in the Board Game Geek and Dice Tower Hall of Fames. And both these games have had a profound impact on board gaming. 1830 is considered the quintessential archetype of the 18XX genre. And Civilization, well, Civilization is its own board game genre, Civilization games. Absolutely huge impact, and Francis goes into the Hall of Fame for these games. Next, I'm going to bring up some sort of industry leaders and influential figures in board gaming as a sort of collective whole. And the first one of those is E. Gary Gygax, because without Dungeons & Dragons, board gaming looks very different. Now, one could argue that Dungeons & Dragons, that's a role-playing game. What's that got to do with board gaming? And I'll point to any number of fantasy, dungeon-crawling type games. The whole way fantasy elements are brought into board gaming. Dungeons & Dragons is profoundly influential on board gaming, and it all starts with Gary Gygax. I think a Board Game Hall of Fame that doesn't include him is deliberately, creating a barrier and going, no, D&D's over there, that doesn't belong. His impact, the impact of D&D is massive on the hobby, and I think he should be included in any Board Game Hall of Fame. In a similar vein, I would include the duo of Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, who created Games Workshop. Games Workshop these days is most known for its Warhammer 40,000, Warhammer Fantasy, Age of Sigmar, miniatures games, but they were also hugely important board game industry people. But if you're just going to look at Games Workshop for their impact on board gaming, you've got things like Talisman, Hero Quest, Space Hulk, Blood Bowl. Games Workshop, profoundly important part of the board gaming hobby, and Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone founded it. I talked before about how the list is predominantly going to be white men from the Northern Hemisphere, but this is going to be the second Steve Jackson on this list. And the second Steve Jackson isn't the one from Games Workshop. He's the one that created Steve Jackson Games. He also designed Ogre and Munchkin. And Steve Jackson Games, really major company, especially in the 80s with like Car Wars, Illuminati, Hunter, a whole bunch of games that came out from Steve Jackson Games. They were one of the big companies through the 80s. And Munchkin, despite my issues with it, is an incredibly important game that brought tons and tons of people into the hobby. But if I was going to marquee Steve Jackson, the US one, alongside one of his games, it would be Ogre, which is a very important and influential game from the 80s. Sticking on the theme of people who created companies and are also board game designers, I'm going to go with Christian T. Peterson, the designer of Twilight Imperium and a bunch of other games, but more importantly, the creator of Fantasy Flight Games. Fantasy Flight Games really got me back into the board gaming hobby properly in about 2005 with the release of Arkham Horror 2nd Edition and games like A Game of Thrones, which he was involved with. Fantasy Flight Games are also, from my point of view, the dominant company in board gaming from about 2005 to maybe 2018, 2019. They put out so many great titles in that time, and that was when Christian T. Peterson was leading the helm. One could definitely argue that Fantasy Flight Games' decline completely coincides to when they were sold to Asmodee and he left. He's probably worth getting in this list solely for Twilight Imperium and its influence on the board gaming genre, but he's also got all these other titles that he designed as well. Plus, he created one of the great design houses for board gaming in board gaming history. Tons of designers came out of Fantasy Flight Games, including Kevin Wilson, Nikki Valens, Eric Lang, and more. So Christian T. Peterson, great designer, and massive impact on the hobby. And then another person who created a game and also created a company, and this time it is Richard Garfield, the company's Wizards of the Coast, and the game is Magic the Gathering. And again, some people might be going, Magic the Gathering's a collectible card game, it's not a board game. Come on, we're thinking more holistically here. We're thinking big, wide impacts on the hobby, and you can't argue that Richard Garfield's impact has been massive. Magic the Gathering is a powerhouse in the hobby and hugely influential. Even if you don't think collectible card games are part of the hobby, that they're their own thing, how cards work in games has been massively influenced by Magic the Gathering. When making my own card game, Shadow and Syndicates, I used the rules from Magic the Gathering for timing, for thinking everything was like how a card's going to interact. By default, I go to Magic the Gathering's timing system, and I think there's a ton of people out there who play games who think the Magic timing system in a card game is the default. Hugely impactful and influential. Plus, he's designed a ton of other games as well, including things like Robo Rally. Let's just put him in the Hall of Fame for designing Robo Rally, not just for building up Magic the Gathering, the juggernaut that it is, and Wizards of the Coast. So yeah, Richard Garfield, absolutely first ballot Hall of Famer. Now I'm going to get straight into people who are principally designers. And I had a laundry list of people for these spots. I'm going to put out 8 designer spots here. 8 people who get in to this first ballot Hall of Fame as designers. And I had like 40 honorable mentions. And I'm going to, well, maybe not honorable mentions, 40 people sitting in the pool waiting to get in that are all Hall of Fame worthy designers. And I'm going to put up a list of those people after I run through this 8. And almost certainly your favorite will be in that list because I probably have missed them out here. So many great designers, only 8 spots here. And let's just kick it off. And the first one, obviously, and there's going to be people who've been watching this video from the start going, where is Dr. Knizia? It's Reiner Knizia. Here he is. If you don't know anything about this guy, he's designed way too many board games. No one should have designed this many board games. And a ton of them are very good. I have no idea about 400 or 500 of them. I've lost track of how many he's designed. So many board games, but things like Tigris and Euphrates, A Modern Art, Ra, Amun-Re. There are so many good Reiner Knizia games that any Hall of Fame without him in it is absolutely missing the point of a Hall of Fame, in my opinion. And I imagine the opinions of tons of people out there in board game land who absolutely think that he is the greatest thing to happen to board game design since sliced bread. So yeah, Reiner Knizia, if I'm just doing a designer Hall of Fame, he's probably the first guy going in. But in a wider Hall of Fame, here he comes in as the first designer in this category, because I was looking at historic designers from earlier eras beforehand. He's the first designer in the sort of modern era that's a lock. Next up, we're going to have a couple of very obvious ones. Klaus Tabor for Catan. I'm not going to go into the impact of Catan too much. Everyone knows it's an influential game. Everyone knows how many people it brought into the hobby and how many copies it sold. Modern board gaming would not look the same without Catan, and we owe that to Klaus. So Klaus absolutely gets in the Hall of Fame just on the merit of one game. That's all it really needs sometimes. And he did design a whole bunch of other games in that series. But Catan, the singular game, that gets him in the Hall of Fame. I don't think anyone would argue with that. In a similar vein, I'm going to go with Alan R. Moon next for Ticket to Ride for exactly the same reason. Ticket to Ride is another one of those games that has sold so many copies and got so many people into the hobby and has just had a profound impact on the board game industry. Alan R. Moon, Ticket to Ride, straight into the Hall of Fame. Next up is the king of co-op games, Matt Leacock, and his signature game is going to be Pandemic. But he's designed so many more co-ops than just Pandemic, and all the varieties of Pandemic. Pandemic's like a whole brand, a whole thing these days. Along with Arkham Horror, Pandemic really changed how we look at board gaming. It went from a competitive thing to something you can do collaboratively. And Pandemic is so important in that space, in the creation of cooperative games as a successful, viable genre. And a lot of that comes down to Matt's designs. My personal favourite game of his is Thunderbirds, which is one of his more obscure titles, and I'm quite partial to Daybreak as well. Matt is a phenomenal designer. Oh, and he also had another big impact on the industry with Legacy games. Now, I know Risk Legacy exists before, but his collaboration with Rob Daviau on Pandemic Legacy was transformative for the hobby. Oh, Rob's another person I need to add into my big long list of people who are waiting in the wings. But Matt gets in on this very first draft. Next up is Donald X. Vaccarino, a designer I know very little about, aside from the fact that he designed Dominion, and Dominion created deck building as a genre, as a mechanic, as a concept and a thing. It's a mechanic that has been taken from its humble roots here in Dominion and just used in so many amazing, interesting, and wonderful ways. From things like Tyrants of the Underdark to Slay the Spire, deck building is possibly the most important new mechanic of the last 20 years. And Dominion also sold like a gazillion copies. So Donald gets to be in this list for designing not just a game that sold bucket loads of copies, but also genuinely creating a mechanic that was transformative to board gaming. Next on the list is Elizabeth Hargrave for Wingspan. Now, what I said about Catan, Wingspan is this generation's Catan. It is the game that opens doors. It is the game that brings people into the hobby. It has sold so many copies as well. I think it just got 100,000 registered users on Board Game Geek, and I think it sold in excess of 2 million copies. It's a game where I will just talk to random people and they will have played Wingspan. It is the new Catan. It is the Catan for the late 2010s, early 2020s. It's the game bringing people into the hobby. Wingspan is one of those games people seem to hate on for some reason, but it's the new Catan. It's bringing in tons and tons of people. It's selling bucket loads of copies, and it's gorgeous. It's a great looking game, and that means Elizabeth gets into the Hall of Fame on first ballot. Next up, one of my favourite designers, Antoine Bowser, and he's here for Seven Wonders, but also Takenoko and Tokaido and a bunch of other games. He's a prolific designer, tons and tons of hits. Seven Wonders is easily his biggest selling game, but he sold a lot of copies, and these games are everywhere, and absolutely a first ballot Hall of Famer. And for the final spot on this list, I'm leaving that up to you. I'm going to put up a bunch of different designers that could have been on this list, that could have been on the Hall of Fame. There's one more slot to put one designer or one design team in. Which one of the following teams or designers would you put into your Hall of Fame in this spot? We only have 8 slots left in the Hall of Fame, and we've done a bunch of designers, we've done a bunch of industry people. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at board gaming a bit more holistically, and I'm going to pick some people from the artistic side. And I'm going to start off, because we were just talking about Wingspan just before, with Beth Sobel as an artist. Now, Beth's done a ton of great work, but obviously Wingspan is the one that is selling all the dollars worth. But if you look through her catalogue, it's a bunch of beautiful art. And I think we need to start talking about artists as being important in board gaming, just as we would designers. I think artists deserve to be in the Hall of Fame on their own merit. And there are 2 other artists I want to include in this initial Hall of Fame. The next one is Ian O'Toole, which you'll know from a whole bunch of games. The most recent one I just got was Galactic Cruise, and that is looking absolutely amazing. Ian has a phenomenal style, he's amazing at bringing games to life and doing just wonderful visuals. The stuff he did on a lot of the Vital Lacerda games are just absolutely fantastic. Ian, absolutely first ballot Hall of Famer when it comes to art. And the final one of the 3 artists I picked, and there are tons of other artists I'm omitting here, but I thought I've got 8 slots left. I'll give 3 to artists just to sort of start that conversation. And that artist I'm going to pick for the 3rd slot is Vincent Dutra. Vincent's work on Museum's my favourite game of his. I think Museum is absolutely stunning, but he's consistently just does beautiful art across so many different games. I think between Beth Sobel, Vincent Dutra, and Ian O'Toole, you have 3 very different artists, 3 amazing styles, and 3 examples about how art makes board games better and how we should do a better job of acknowledging the artists in board gaming, because we might not have them going forward if certain people have their way and destroy art as we know it. And I think now is the time for us to be acknowledging how important art is to board gaming. Now, we're down to 5 slots, and I'm going to use the next 2 slots for people I consider polymaths, people who do a whole bunch of different things. And each one might not quite get them in the Hall of Fame for an individual game or for individual achievement, but if you add it all up, they are more interesting and compelling cases for the Hall of Fame. And the first one of those is Jeff Engelstein, who's the designer of Space Cadets and a few other games. But he's also written a whole bunch of books on board gaming, in particular a profoundly important book about board gaming mechanics, where he classified all of the mechanics in board gaming. And this is sort of the building blocks of our industry. Jeff's done a great job of cataloging and itemizing those. A very influential and important book in that space. But he's also the president of the Tabletop Game Designers Association. And this is a big deal. Board gaming is maturing as an industry, and it's getting sort of hopefully past the sort of cottage stage. And having a formal association like the Tabletop Game Designers Association as a guild is something very, very important for legitimacy, for acting as a collective group. And he was a driving force behind setting this up, and he's the first president. And I think for his contribution to not just designing games, but writing about games, and also helping set up an industry body to push the cases of designers and to improve how the hobby is perceived, or how the industry is perceived legitimately. I'm going to include Jeff in this Hall of Fame as well. And on a similar note, the next person up is Jamie Stegmaier. And he's here not just as a designer, which he possibly could be for Scythe and a few of his other games, not just as a publisher, which he's published Wingspan, it's a very big and successful game, and Stonemaier Games definitely has a style and an impact and an influence, but also as a content creator. He has a very successful social media presence. He's given tons and tons of advice to up-and-coming designers and up-and-coming publishers, and his work across the whole industry touches a lot of people. So I think Jamie could be in the Hall of Fame for a whole bunch of reasons, but he does a lot. He's a bit of a polymath when it comes to all the different tools in the toolbox of board gaming. He's a writer, he's a publisher, he's a designer, and for me, he's a Hall of Famer. And that leaves 3 last spots, and this is probably going to be the controversial bits, but I'm going to give these spots to people who've impacted the hobby from a media point of view. And the first of that is the team of Will Wheaton and Felicia Day for Tabletop. Now, Tabletop's defunct. It hasn't been around for quite a while, but it was huge in bringing people into the hobby. They did live playthroughs with a lot of charm, high production values, and nothing since has come close to being that successful, that viewed, and that well made, to be frank. Tabletop was massive. It was hugely important. And I think because of that, Will Wheaton and Felicia Day deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. Now, 2 more spots left, and the next one's going to Tom Vassell. Now, I don't always agree with Tom. In fact, I disagree with his reviews a hell of a lot. But there's no denying the impact the Dice Tower has had on board gaming. Tom is the gold standard of board game reviewing. The Dice Tower is where you go if you want to find a board game review. They're everywhere. They're ubiquitous. They've reviewed every game. It's like this. They've got a cast of thousands doing it. But they have a video for every single situation. Tom's impact on the conversations around board gaming, how board gaming is marketed, how board gaming is talked about, how board gaming is reviewed and discussed. He's easily the single most influential person in this space. And I think if we're having a Hall of Fame that is more holistic, that looks at board gaming as an industry, I think it's very hard to underrate how important Tom's influence in the industry has been. And I think someone like him deserves to go in a board game Hall of Fame because of how many people in the industry he's touched and how influential he's been over the years. And that brings me to my final person, and that is Scott Eldon, the creator of Board Game Geek. And yeah, I've actually just acknowledged that the people who created the 2 Halls of Fame, the Dice Tower one and the Board Game Geek Hall of Fame, they absolutely, as individuals, deserve to be in Hall of Fame because Board Game Geek is the definitive resource for board gaming. There's nothing else. Like, people have come and tried to take them down, tried to build an alternative, and they don't come anywhere near it. Board Game Geek has everything. It has files, it has a huge community, it has all of the games listed. It is an invaluable resource, and Scott Eldon has been plodding away at that for 25 odd years now, and I think he absolutely deserves the credit for all of that long work and for creating Board Game Geek, which is, say, possibly the single most valuable online resource for board gaming. In fact, I'm not going to say possibly, it absolutely is the single most valuable online resource for board gaming. And I think on that alone, Scott deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. So that is my list. Obviously, I've missed someone because 25 people, it's a giant industry. It's been an industry for a long time. There's so many people involved, so many great designers, so many great publishers, so many great artists, and so many great content creators and other media people, and just writers and everything else around the hobby. I hope this has been a thought-provoking list. I hope, despite the title sounding quite negative, that it's been a positive experience to watch. And I hope you're sitting there going, oh, I'd put this person in, because I want to see what your 25 Hall of Fame people would be. I'd also see who you think would go into the next class. If you take my class as is, who's going in next? Who would be the next 5 people going in the Hall of Fame? Let me know in the comments. And a reminder, 3 Minute Board Games does not do paid content, but I am putting out a book. So if you wouldn't mind maybe pre-ordering this book, I'm going to put the link in the description below. It's about 101 games I think are absolutely awesome. And these 101 games are all published in the last 20 years. And I wanted to go for games that not only played well, but looked amazing. A combination of art and artistry within the game. These are 101 games I really like. It's not just my top 100. There's a few many games in my top 100 I had to keep out because they're either too old or they're too ugly. And I wanted that combination of great game and great looking game for this book. So yeah, 101 board games to try before you die. Pre-order it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and a whole bunch of other places. Please click on the link below. And a reminder, 3 Minute Board Games does not do paid content. I make my money from YouTube ads, Patreon, and hopefully selling some damn books and games. Keep us independent by supporting us on Patreon or pre-order the book. That'd be great. And until next time, take care, everyone.